In the winter of 1895, on a forested hill outside Asheville, North Carolina, a building was completed that did not resemble a home in any ordinary sense. It arrived fully formed, vast, deliberate, and overwhelming. With 250 rooms spread across approximately 175,000 square feet, the Biltmore Estate became the largest private residence ever built in the United States. And almost immediately, it carried a problem no visitor could see. It was built at the exact moment the conditions that made it possible began to disappear. Because Biltmore was not just a mansion. It was a permanent expense disguised as permanence itself. A structure so large it could not be paused, so complex it could not be simplified, and so costly it would eventually force a decision its creator never intended to face. In the decades ahead, this house would survive, but only by surrendering the one thing it was designed to protect: private power. Its owner, George Washington Vanderbilt II, did not conceive Biltmore as a place meant to be lived in quietly. From the beginning, it was a declaration, an architectural statement made at the height of American industrial wealth, when money believed scale alone could guarantee legacy. The logic was simple. If something was large enough, impressive enough, and expensive enough, it would endure. Biltmore rose during the peak of the Gilded Age, an era of extraordinary fortunes and equally extraordinary inequality. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel, oil, and finance created dynasties almost overnight. The United States had no hereditary aristocracy, but it was determined to invent one in stone. Mansions became the chosen language. Size replaced lineage. Square footage substituted for history. George Vanderbilt was uniquely positioned within this experiment. He was born into one of the wealthiest families in American history. The Vanderbilt fortune, built through shipping and railroads by Cornelius Vanderbilt, had reshaped the nation's economy. By the time George came of age, the family name was synonymous with wealth itself. Money was not something he needed to pursue. It surrounded him from birth. Yet George Vanderbilt was not an industrialist. He did not run railroads or manage monopolies. He was a collector, a reader, a patron of culture. Educated privately and well-traveled, he gravitated toward books, art, and European traditions rather than boardrooms. He admired old-world estates, French chateaux, English country houses, places where land, architecture, and identity had fused over centuries. Biltmore was his attempt to translate that model onto American soil. Construction began in 1889 and took 6 years to complete. More than 1,000 workers were employed at its peak. The project consumed enormous resources. Indiana limestone for the facade, vast quantities of timber, custom ironwork, and imported materials from across Europe. The estate required its own infrastructure: roads, a private railway spur, water systems, and eventually a self-contained village to house workers. The house itself was designed by architect Richard Morris Hunt, one of the most prominent figures of the era. Hunt modeled Biltmore on French Renaissance chateaux, particularly those of the Loire Valley. The result was less a house than a palace transplanted into the Appalachian Mountains. Towers, turrets, and sculpted stone announced power long before a visitor reached the entrance. Inside, the scale intensified. Ceilings soared. Hallways stretched. The banquet hall alone rose 7 stories high, lined with tapestries and lit by massive chandeliers. The library housed over 20,000 volumes, one of the largest private book collections in the country. There were indoor plumbing systems, elevators, central heating, and electricity at a time when most Americans still lacked basic amenities. Every detail reinforced the same message. This was not excess by accident. It was excess by design. Yet for all its grandeur, Biltmore was never anchored in necessity. It was not located near industry or commerce. It did not serve as an administrative hub for the Vanderbilt rail empire. Asheville was chosen not for strategy, but for scenery. The surrounding Blue Ridge Mountains offered isolation, beauty, and the illusion of timelessness. Biltmore was meant to stand apart from the noise of modern America, even as it depended entirely on modern American wealth. This contradiction lay at the heart of the estate. At the moment Biltmore was completed, American wealth stood at its most confident. Fortunes seemed inexhaustible. Industrial expansion felt permanent. Stone was expected to stabilize money. Architecture was supposed to convert volatility into legacy. Biltmore embodied that belief perfectly. But history rarely respects intention. What made Biltmore so striking was not just its size, but its timing. By 1895, the forces that had created the Vanderbilt fortune were already changing. Railroad monopolies faced increasing regulation. Competition intensified. The easy phase of expansion was ending. Wealth built rapidly now required careful management to sustain. The era of effortless dominance was quietly closing. Biltmore did not reflect that shift. It ignored it. Instead, the estate locked itself into a scale that assumed endless surplus. Maintaining 250 rooms required hundreds of staff, maids, cooks, gardeners, engineers, and administrators. The estate operated like a small city. Fires had to be lit daily. Grounds demanded constant care. Repairs never stopped. From the moment it opened, Biltmore began consuming resources simply to remain intact. Visitors saw opulence, not cost. They experienced warmth, light, and abundance, not the infrastructure required to sustain it. Like all great monuments, Biltmore hid its fragility behind spectacle. George Vanderbilt moved into the house with his wife Edith and later their daughter Cornelia. Yet even as a family residence, Biltmore resisted intimacy. Rooms were vast and formal. Personal space dissolved into architectural scale. The house was designed to impress guests, not nurture domestic routine. It was a place of arrival, not settlement. In this way, Biltmore functioned more as a symbol than a shelter. The estate projected an idea that American wealth had arrived at a level comparable to Europe's oldest aristocracies. That money, translated into land and stone, could escape time. That permanence could be built deliberately rather than inherited slowly. But permanence demands more than construction. It demands continuity, economic, social, and generational. Biltmore assumed those conditions without securing them. As the Gilded Age reached its apex, Biltmore stood as its most literal monument. Larger than any private home before it. More expensive. More ambitious. It was the physical manifestation of a national belief. That scale itself was stability. Biltmore was not a home created by necessity or community. It was a monument erected by confidence. Confidence in money, confidence in growth, confidence in the idea that ambition could outrun consequence. The question Biltmore raises is not architectural. It is structural. What happens when ambition outruns sustainability? The answer would not arrive immediately. But it was already embedded in the stone, waiting for history to apply pressure. The Vanderbilt fortune did not collapse in scandal. It did not vanish overnight. It thinned the way great industrial fortunes often do, through inheritance, shifting markets, and the slow arrival of rules that monopoly-era wealth was never built to tolerate. By the time Biltmore was completed in 1895, the Vanderbilt name still carried the aura of inevitability. The family's wealth, rooted in railroads and shipping, had once felt like a natural force. But industrial fortunes are not like land. They do not renew themselves simply by existing. They require conditions, growth, leverage, dominance, and an environment where regulation arrives late. Those conditions were already changing. Cornelius Vanderbilt built wealth through motion, through routes, schedules, consolidation, competition, and aggressive reinvestment. His fortune was not a static pile of money. It was a machine that produced money because it controlled critical infrastructure. His advantage came from being early, ruthless, and positioned at the center of America's economic expansion. But by the late 1880s and early 1890s, railroads were no longer a frontier. They were a network. Networks don't expand forever. They mature. They saturate. And once saturation arrives, power becomes harder to defend than it was to build. Profit margins tighten. Competitors appear. Labor becomes organized enough to push back. Government begins to notice that private control over public arteries carries political consequences. A dynasty built on expansion now needed something different: stewardship. But stewardship is not what most heirs inherit. This is the Vanderbilt pattern, what people later romanticized as a curse. Not superstition, not moral punishment, just a structural mismatch. Vast inherited wealth drifting into a new era that demanded flexibility. George Vanderbilt entered adulthood inside this shift. Born in 1862, He inherited the family's magnitude without inheriting the act of building it. The disciplines that built the Vanderbilt empire, cost control, negotiation, labor pressure, political timing, were not skills he needed to survive. He was insulated by scale, and that insulation shaped his identity. George did not live like a railroad commander. He lived like a European patron. He collected books. He traveled. He studied art and architecture. His ambition wasn't expansion, it was permanence. In Europe, permanence came from centuries of land ownership, cultural obligation, and estates that could shrink quietly when conditions tightened. A great house could seal a wing, cut staff, lease fields, and endure decline without announcing it. American industrial wealth had no such elasticity. It arrived fast. It split through inheritance. It moved with markets. And when pressure came, it couldn't simply become smaller without becoming weaker. This is where Biltmore becomes more than a mansion. Because when George commissioned the estate in 1889, he wasn't reinforcing an expanding empire. He was converting liquid power into a movable form, locking wealth into stone and land just as the broader system demanded adaptability. And the first warning arrived almost immediately. In 1893, the United States plunged into a major financial crisis. Railroads failed. Banks collapsed. Unemployment surged. The optimism of the early 1890s cracked under real economic gravity. Biltmore did not slow down. It did not reduce scope. It did not pivot. Construction continued because the logic of the project assumed that the Vanderbilt fortune could absorb anything. That assumption was understandable. But it was also the beginning of the trap. Biltmore wasn't built like an investment. It was built like a decision that could not be reversed. Stone does not refinance. A 250-room house does not scale down gently. A private estate does not become cheaper just because the economy becomes harsher. And that is why the pattern matters. Other wealthy families, especially those closer to industry, kept their capital mobile. They could shift investments, sell assets, pivot into new sectors, and restructure holdings. But a house like Biltmore is not a portfolio. It is a fixed obligation. Once built, it demands a constant stream of fuel, labor, repairs, and staff, whether the owner wants that reality or not. George did not see this as a problem. He saw it as legacy. But legacy is not created by beauty alone. It requires the ability to survive when conditions become hostile. And by the 1890s, conditions were already moving in that direction. Railroads faced increasing public scrutiny. Federal oversight was tightening. The nation's relationship with monopolistic power was changing. The same America that had celebrated private empire building was beginning to resent it. Biltmore, completed in 1895, looked timeless. Economically, it was already dated. Because the Gilded Age gave George Vanderbilt the illusion that wealth was stable enough to turn into stone. But industrial wealth is not stable. It is seasonal. It rises with expansion and becomes vulnerable in maturity. The Vanderbilt pattern was never that they ran out of money overnight. It was that the rules changed faster than dynastic behavior did. And Biltmore was built at exactly the wrong moment to ignore that. The estate would soon demand something the Vanderbilt system no longer produced reliably: endless surplus. It was one thing to own a fortune. It was another thing to feed a structure that never stopped eating. And while the house dazzled visitors above ground, the real story was forming underneath, inside boilers, payrolls, repairs, and the quiet arithmetic of maintenance. Because the darkest part of Biltmore's history was not the construction. It was what came after. A machine can be built once, but it must be fed forever. And Biltmore was built to consume. From the moment Biltmore Estate opened in 1895, it was already operating at a loss, just not in any way that could be seen from the outside. There was no financial collapse, no emergency meeting, no public reckoning. What existed instead was something far more dangerous: a structure that consumed resources continuously, regardless of circumstance. Biltmore did not behave like a house. It behaved like infrastructure. The estate required hundreds of full-time employees simply to function. Maids, cooks, footmen, gardeners, stable hands, electricians, engineers, plumbers, foresters, administrators, each role necessary, none optional. This workforce was not assembled for luxury. It was assembled because the house could not operate without it. even when no guests were present, even when the family was away, even when rooms stood unused. The mansion could not be paused. Heating systems had to run through winter to protect stone, wood, and plaster. Fires had to be lit daily in dozens of fireplaces. Boilers required constant supervision. Electrical systems, still experimental in the 1890s, needed trained staff to prevent failure or fire. Water systems, plumbing, drainage, and sewage were private responsibilities, not public utilities. Every problem that cities distributed across thousands of taxpayers Biltmore internalized. That was the cost of isolation. The estate generated its own electricity years before rural electrification existed. It maintained its own roads, its own power plant, its own workshops, its own village. These systems did not generate profit. They existed to preserve autonomy. Autonomy is expensive. Most large homes of the era could scale down seasonally. Owners left. Staff was reduced. Wings were closed. Fires went cold. Biltmore could not do this without visible degradation. Its size made partial operation inefficient. Heating a single suite still required heating the system that served dozens. Closing rooms saved little. Maintenance costs remained constant. The house demanded full commitment or visible decay. This is the critical distinction. Biltmore did not respond to use. It responded to time. Stone weathers whether walked on or not. Roofs leak whether rooms are occupied or not. Wood dries, plaster cracks, foundations settle. Grandeur does not slow entropy. It multiplies the surface's entropy can attack. Maintenance was relentless and cumulative. Every repair exposed another vulnerability. Fixing one problem revealed two more. Skilled labor was required because nothing about the house was standard. Fixtures were custom. Materials were imported. Replacement was never simple. Every intervention required expertise, coordination, and cost. This was not a mansion aging gracefully. It was a system aging aggressively. Labor costs followed the same logic. Staffing could not be reduced cleanly. Biltmore's workforce was hierarchical and interdependent. Removing one layer strained another. Supervisors managed specialists. Specialists supported systems. Systems supported rooms. Rooms supported appearance. Once appearance slipped, decline became public. That fear, of visible retreat, locked the estate into inertia. To preserve the illusion of permanence, spending had to continue. To stop spending meant acknowledging vulnerability. And vulnerability contradicted the very purpose of the house. This created a trap. Biltmore was too large to fail quietly and too expensive to maintain indefinitely. The estates surrounding farms and forests helped, but only marginally. Agricultural operations offset food costs. Timber provided modest income. But these were supplements, not solutions. They were never designed to support a structure of this magnitude. The mansion consumed more than the land could reasonably provide. Unlike European estates that evolved alongside revenue-producing land over centuries, Biltmore attempted to leap directly to the finished form. It imported the shell of aristocracy without the slow economic ecosystem that sustained it elsewhere. Everything was immediate. Everything was maximal. Everything assumed surplus. This assumption hardened into daily reality. Coal arrived by the ton. Wages went out weekly. Repairs accumulated monthly. Systems aged yearly. None of these costs declined with reduced use. None could be deferred indefinitely without damage. The estate did not bleed suddenly. It drained steadily. And because the drain was predictable, it was easy to ignore until it wasn't. This is where inevitability enters. Financial systems adapt. Buildings do not. Once Biltmore existed, it locked its owners into a permanent operating posture. There was no scenario where it became inexpensive without ceasing to be itself. Downsizing meant symbolic defeat. Closure meant decay. Selling meant dismantling identity. So nothing changed. The house continued operating at full scale because it had been designed without a middle state. There was no smaller Biltmore it could retreat into. The estate existed as dominance or concession. That rigidity made future decisions unavoidable. When economic pressure eventually intensified through taxation, shifting labor expectations, and declining returns, the mansion did not negotiate. It waited. And waiting, for a machine like this, meant consuming whatever remained. By the time George Vanderbilt's health declined and leadership weakened, the system was already locked. The estate did not depend on vision anymore. It depended on cash flow. Whoever inherited Biltmore would not inherit a home. They would inherit a machine that demanded constant feeding, a machine that could not be slowed without consequence, a machine built to project permanence while quietly exhausting the very wealth that sustained it. This is the truth at the center of Biltmore's story. The mansion did not fail because of mismanagement. It failed because it functioned exactly as designed. And once built, design becomes destiny. The house stood flawless above ground while pressure accumulated below, inside boilers, balance sheets, payrolls, and repair logs. Long before land was sold. Long before the public was invited in. Long before survival became the goal. Biltmore was already unsustainable. The only unanswered question was who would be forced to admit it first. That question would not be answered by architecture. It would be answered by the man who built it, and the limits of the life he had left to sustain it. George Washington Vanderbilt, too, did not fail because he was reckless. He failed because he was unsuited to command something that required constant aggression to survive. This distinction matters. Biltmore Estate did not require taste, education, or cultural refinement. It required vigilance, ruthlessness, continuous financial pressure applied without sentiment. It was a machine that punished hesitation and rewarded control. George Vanderbilt was not built that way. From the beginning, he approached wealth as a condition rather than a weapon. Unlike the industrialists who created America's largest fortunes, George did not rise through competition. He inherited a rival. The conflicts that sharpened men like his grandfather, labor strikes, price wars, infrastructure failures, were never his responsibility. That absence shaped him. George Vanderbilt was introspective by nature. He preferred books to boardrooms, correspondence to confrontation. His private library eventually grew beyond 20,000 volumes, covering history, science, philosophy, and literature in multiple languages. He read constantly. He traveled widely. He absorbed culture. This was not indulgence. It was orientation. Biltmore was designed to support that orientation. The house existed as an extension of his inner life. Quiet rooms, long corridors, controlled views, curated solitude. It was not a command center for wealth. It was a refuge from obligation. But refuge is incompatible with scale. A structure the size of Biltmore does not forgive retreat. It does not reward reflection. It demands presence. Every system beneath the house required oversight. Every department required discipline. Every inefficiency multiplied daily. The mansion needed an operator. It received a curator. George Vanderbilt did not treat Biltmore as an enterprise because he never intended it to be one. The estate was not designed to generate income, respond to markets, or adapt to pressure. It was designed to remain correct, to stay beautiful, balanced, and complete. Correctness is fragile. When costs rose, George absorbed them rather than challenged them. When systems demanded more labor, he funded them rather than restructured them. When scale became burdensome, he preserved it rather than questioned it. This was not incompetence. It was temperament. He believed, reasonably, given his upbringing, that the Vanderbilt fortune was stable enough to absorb permanence. He trusted continuity without enforcing it. He assumed money would behave tomorrow as it had yesterday. Biltmore was built on that assumption. The house did not discipline him. It enabled him. Unlike industrial ventures that demand adjustment or collapse, Biltmore insulated its owner from feedback. The estate functioned smoothly as long as funds continued. Problems were handled by managers. Costs were distributed invisibly. The house did not argue. It simply consumed. This allowed George Vanderbilt to remain psychologically distant from consequence. He experienced the house as a finished environment rather than a system under strain. When something broke, it was fixed. When costs rose, they were paid. The machine shielded him from its own demands. Until it couldn't. As years passed, George's health declined. Chronic illness limited his stamina. Long periods of travel became exhausting. Oversight became delegation. Delegation became abstraction. The mansion did not care. It continued demanding the same intensity from an owner increasingly unable and unwilling to supply it. Biltmore required confrontation. George Vanderbilt avoided it. The house required contraction. He resisted it. This resistance was fatal. Downsizing Biltmore would have meant admitting that the original vision was flawed. Closing wings would have signaled retreat. Reducing staff would have revealed vulnerability. Every corrective action felt like a betrayal of the ideal the house represented. So nothing changed. George Vanderbilt chose preservation over adaptation. He chose stability over strategy. He chose beauty over sustainability. Those choices were coherent with his character. They were disastrous for the estate. By the time George Vanderbilt died in 1914, the outcome was already sealed. The house was complete, immaculate, and structurally intact. But its survival depended on conditions that no longer existed and leadership that had never been designed to enforce discipline. His death did not create crisis. It exposed one. The estate had no redundancy, no secondary engine, no strategic flexibility. It had been built around a single will, and that will was gone. This is the critical insight of this. Biltmore did not collapse because George Vanderbilt lacked intelligence or generosity. It collapsed because a structure that rigid requires a personality that is harder than refinement allows. The house needed someone capable of shrinking it. It had someone who believed in preserving it. The house needed someone ruthless enough to subordinate beauty to arithmetic. It had someone who believed beauty justified arithmetic. George Vanderbilt was not the wrong man morally. He was the wrong man structurally. An architecture, once built, does not adjust to temperament. Temperament adjusts or breaks. George Vanderbilt broke quietly. He left behind a mansion that had outgrown the human scale required to govern it, a machine that could not be paused, a legacy that could not be softened. What followed, land sales, public opening, conversion, were not betrayals of his vision. They were acknowledgments that his vision could not survive him. Biltmore did not defeat George Vanderbilt. It simply waited until he was no longer strong enough to sustain the illusion that it could last unchanged. And once that illusion collapsed, the mansion's fate became administrative rather than dramatic. Not ruin, not scandal, just arithmetic asserting itself. This marks the turning point. The house has won. The man is gone. What remains is a structure too large to forgive gentleness, and a legacy that will now be rewritten by people far less interested in preserving the dream than in surviving its consequences. George Washington Vanderbilt, too, did not live long enough to see Biltmore fail. That fact defines everything that followed. He died on March 6, 1914, at the age of 51, just 19 years after Biltmore Estate was completed. In the scale of European aristocracy, 19 years would have been a footnote. In the American Gilded Age, it was an entire lifespan of ambition compressed into a single generation. The mansion outlived its creator, but the vision did not. George Vanderbilt's death was not sudden, but it was premature. He had struggled with health issues for years, including chronic respiratory problems that worsened over time. The official cause was complications from surgery related to appendicitis, but tuberculosis and long-term physical stress were contributing factors. By the early 1910s, his health had deteriorated visibly. Travel exhausted him. The routines required to sustain Biltmore strained him. The house demanded energy he no longer had. This is often overlooked in discussions of Biltmore's decline. The mansion was not merely expensive. It was labor-intensive in a way that assumed a strong, present owner. George Vanderbilt was neither strong nor present by the end. His retreat from active life coincided with the moment the estate most needed decisive leadership. For nearly 2 decades, George had lived inside a world he carefully curated. Biltmore was not built to accommodate aging, illness, or absence. It was designed for hosting, movement, and constant orchestration. When its creator slowed, the system did not. The estate continued operating at full scale, even as its center weakened. By 1914, the contradiction was complete. The largest private mansion in America stood fully intact, meticulously maintained, and culturally complete. But the man for whom it was built was fading. The future of the estate had never been articulated beyond his lifetime. There was no succession plan that addressed scale. There was no financial restructuring to prepare for transition. The house assumed continuity. Reality delivered rupture. George Vanderbilt's death marked the end of Biltmore as a personal project. Everything after became management rather than vision. The distinction is critical. Vision tolerates loss and excess. Management does not. His widow, Edith Vanderbilt, inherited the estate at a moment of global instability. World War I erupted just months after George's death. American economic conditions tightened. Social attitudes toward extreme private wealth shifted rapidly. Tax structures grew more aggressive. Labor expectations changed. Edith did not inherit a sanctuary. She inherited a system already under pressure. Where George had been introspective and idealistic, Edith was pragmatic. She quickly recognized that Biltmore, as it existed, could not survive indefinitely. The estate was not simply large, it was inflexible. Its costs were fixed. Its layout discouraged reduction. Its symbolism resisted compromise. Most importantly, its purpose was gone. George Vanderbilt had built Biltmore as a personal refuge for learning, culture, and controlled engagement with society. Without him, the mansion lost its organizing principle. The rooms remained, but the intention behind them evaporated. The library no longer reflected a living mind. The salons no longer hosted their creator. The estate became a monument without a subject. Edith faced decisions George never had to make. She had to consider selling land, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Over time, the estate's acreage shrank dramatically. What began as roughly 125,000 acres was reduced to about 8,000. This was not mismanagement. It was survival. Each sale marked a concession. The dream of a self-contained aristocratic domain dissolved piece by piece. Biltmore survived physically, but only by abandoning the scale that had defined it. The estate was no longer an assertion of permanence. It became a negotiation with reality. This transformation reveals the emotional core of this. George Vanderbilt did not fail publicly, that he failed privately, by leaving too early. 19 years is not enough time for a structure of that magnitude to justify itself. The mansion required decades of stewardship, adjustment, and redefinition. It needed an owner who could evolve its function as conditions changed. George Vanderbilt never had that chance. His death froze Biltmore in an incomplete state, not unfinished in construction, but unfinished in meaning. The house was complete. The life around it was not. This is why Biltmore feels different from European estates of similar scale. Those properties evolved over centuries, absorbing wars, economic shifts, and generational reinterpretation. Biltmore had no such buffer. It was conceived whole and lost its creator before it could adapt. The emotional rupture was subtle but profound. There was no dramatic abandonment, no immediate decay. Instead, there was quiet subtraction. Rooms closed. Staff numbers reduced. Land sold. Dreams narrowed. The mansion lived on. The vision receded. George Vanderbilt's early death transformed Biltmore from an aspiration into an inheritance problem. What had been an expression of individual taste became a logistical challenge for successors. The house stopped asking what it could be and began asking what it could afford. That shift is irreversible. The tragedy is not that George Vanderbilt died young. Many wealthy men did. The tragedy is that his death occurred before the estate's identity could stabilize. Biltmore never transitioned from dream to institution. It skipped directly from creation to compromise. In this sense, the mansion mirrors its era. The Gilded Age promised permanence through scale, but delivered fragility through speed. Biltmore was built faster than the social structures that could support it. When the builder vanished, nothing was ready to replace him. Edith Vanderbilt did what was necessary. She preserved what she could. She reduced what she had to. Eventually, she made the most consequential decision of all, opening Biltmore to the public. That choice did not happen immediately, but it was inevitable from the moment George died. The estate could no longer exist solely as a private home. Its costs required an audience. Its survival required visibility. Privacy, the original purpose, became unsustainable. This inversion began with George Vanderbilt's death. The dream ended early, not because it was flawed in conception, but because it was unfinished in execution. Biltmore needed time. Time was denied. What remained was architecture without authorial intent, grandeur without guidance, and a structure too large to fail quietly. The mansion survived. But from 1914 onward, it survived as something else. Not a home, not a vision, but a question, waiting to be answered by forces far less gentle than its creator ever was. When George Washington Vanderbilt II died in 1914, the transformation of Biltmore Estate did not happen overnight. There was no immediate abandonment, no visible collapse, no dramatic fire sale. Instead, decline arrived the way it usually does for great estates, quietly, administratively, and without ceremony. The empire did not fall. It was dismantled. At its height, the Biltmore Estate encompassed approximately 125,000 acres across western North Carolina. It was not merely a mansion surrounded by land. It was a privately managed domain. Farms, forests, villages, roads, and utilities operated under a single vision. The estate had its own power plant, its own workforce, and its own internal economy. It functioned less like a home and more like a state within a state. That scale became its liability. After George Vanderbilt's death, Edith Vanderbilt inherited not only the mansion, but the responsibility for sustaining an operation designed for an entirely different economic and social climate. The early 20th century did not reward private excess the way the Gilded Age had. Progressive-era reforms were already reshaping taxation. Public sentiment toward inherited wealth hardened. The First World War strained resources and redirected national priorities. Biltmore was suddenly out of time. The estate's financial demands were relentless. Hundreds of employees required year-round wages. Infrastructure required constant upkeep. Forestry operations, once a point of pride, demanded investment before yielding returns. Agriculture required management, not nostalgia. The mansion itself, 250 rooms across 175,000 square feet, consumed resources simply by existing. None of this was optional. Edith Vanderbilt faced a choice that would define the next half-century of Biltmore's history. She could attempt to preserve the estate in its original form, bleeding resources until collapse, or she could reduce it deliberately to ensure survival. Pride would have favored preservation. Reality did not. The land sales began quietly. Acreage was sold in parcels, often to local farmers, developers, or public entities. These were not symbolic gestures. They were structural amputations. Each sale reduced not just land, but the idea of Biltmore as a self-contained aristocratic domain. The estate's borders retreated steadily inward. From approximately 125,000 acres, Biltmore shrank to roughly 8,000. The reduction was not a failure of stewardship. It was an acknowledgement of scale. No private family could justify holding that much land without a corresponding industrial engine to support it. The railroads that had made such ownership plausible no longer belonged to the Vanderbilts in the same way. The fortune that had enabled Biltmore was fragmenting. The mansion remained untouched for a time. This created a visual contradiction. The house still appeared monumental, intact, and authoritative. Visitors driving through the gates saw no evidence of decline. Inside, however, the logic had shifted. Decisions were no longer driven by ambition. They were driven by cost-benefit analysis. Survival replaced pride. Rooms were closed when possible. Staff numbers were reduced. Entertaining declined. The rhythms of the house changed. What had once been a space designed to host became a structure managed to endure. The estate's internal culture transformed from visionary to custodial. The Great Depression accelerated everything. By the 1930s, economic reality left no room for illusion. Taxes increased. Agricultural income declined. Maintenance costs remained fixed. The mansion's symbolic value could not offset its operational burden. Edith Vanderbilt and her successors confronted the unavoidable truth. Biltmore could not survive as a purely private residence. In 1930, the unthinkable became policy. Biltmore opened to the public. This decision marked the definitive end of the estate as an aristocratic retreat. What had been designed as America's most private mansion became a destination. Ticketing replaced invitation. Tours replaced hosting. The flow of visitors replaced the flow of elites. The irony was total. The mansion built to escape public scrutiny now depended on it. This shift reframed every aspect of the estate. Preservation took precedence over privacy. Public access dictated maintenance schedules. Interpretation replaced intimacy. Rooms were curated not for living, but for viewing. The house ceased to evolve organically and instead froze into presentation. Yet this transformation saved it. Revenue from tourism stabilized the estate. Public interest justified preservation. Biltmore transitioned from a private burden to a cultural asset. The mansion survived not because the Vanderbilt dynasty endured, but because the property was repurposed. The dynasty did not. The Vanderbilt name gradually receded from economic relevance. While other branches of the family adapted or diversified, the Biltmore line became custodians rather than conquerors. Their roles shifted from owners of excess to managers of legacy. This distinction matters. Ownership implies control. Management implies constraint. The mansion outlived the ambition that created it. The estate remained, but the conditions that justified its scale vanished. Biltmore became a monument to a moment rather than a platform for power. This is the central truth. Great houses do not collapse when money disappears. They collapse when purpose does. Biltmore survived because its purpose changed. But that survival came at a cost. The original vision, of a self-sustaining aristocratic estate modeled after European precedents, failed completely. What remained was an adapted structure, stripped of its original function and sustained through public consumption. The land sales tell this story more clearly than any ledger. Each acre sold represented a retreat from permanence. Each boundary adjusted inward acknowledged that the dream of unlimited private scale had ended. The estate's contraction was not random. It was deliberate, systematic, and irreversible. The mansion stood still. The empire moved backward. This pattern is not unique to Biltmore. It is the fate of most American megastates built during the Gilded Age. They were conceived in a narrow window when private wealth briefly outpaced public accountability. Once that window closed, only adaptation allowed survival. Those that refused disappeared. Biltmore chose a different path. By accepting its transformation into an asset rather than a residence, the estate ensured its physical continuity at the expense of dynastic continuity. The house lived on. The family's dominance did not. Mansions can outlive dynasties because stone does not require belief. People do. Biltmore did not fall. It was converted. From empire to asset. From private vision to public monument. From personal dream to managed inheritance. The land remembers what the dynasty could not sustain. And the mansion stands today not as proof of Vanderbilt's success, but as evidence of what happens when scale outpaces succession and survival requires surrender. From a distance, Biltmore Estate appears warm in its excess. The limestone facade catches light softly. Windows repeat in elegant rhythm. Terraces open toward gardens designed to suggest ease, order, and cultivated leisure. Everything about the exterior implies comfort through abundance. Inside, that promise dissolves. Biltmore was never designed to be intimate. It was designed to impress. That single distinction explains its psychological failure as a home. The architecture prioritizes scale over closeness, symmetry over warmth, and visibility over habit. Rooms expand outward rather than inward. Ceilings rise instead of settling. Corridors stretch beyond necessity. The house does not gather life, it disperses it. A home compresses experience. Biltmore dilutes it. The mansion contains 250 rooms, yet very few were intended for daily living. Many spaces exist purely as declarations. Banquet halls dwarf conversation. Salons emphasize proportion rather than comfort. Galleries frame movement as procession, not pause. Even private rooms feel staged, as though waiting to be observed rather than inhabited. This was not accidental. George Vanderbilt admired European estates where grandeur communicated authority. But those estates evolved slowly, softened by generations of use. Furniture shifted. Rooms changed function. Scale was moderated by familiarity. Biltmore arrived complete, imposing its final form immediately. There was no adjustment period, no gradual domestication of space. The result was architectural alienation. Family life never established a natural rhythm within the house. Children were educated elsewhere. Guests often outnumbered relatives. Staff presence was constant, while family presence was intermittent. The mansion functioned less like a household and more like a permanently staffed venue. Staff heavy. Family light. Hundreds of employees operated the estate year-round. Housekeepers, cooks, engineers, gardeners, drivers, and supervisors maintained a system that could not pause. Their presence was essential, but it reinforced hierarchy rather than intimacy. Service corridors ensured invisibility. Bells summoned assistance without interaction. The architecture preserved distance even while depending on labor. This environment cultivated a specific kind of loneliness. Not isolation through neglect, but isolation through excess. Private rooms became islands separated by long corridors and staircases. Informal encounters were unlikely. Casual gathering required intention. Silence lingered between spaces, broken not by domestic noise, but by controlled movement. Biltmore made absence easy. In smaller homes, presence is unavoidable. In this house, days could pass without meaningful interaction simply because the structure absorbed people. Emotional distance was reinforced physically. Intimacy had no architectural support. The library illustrates this dynamic perfectly. Often celebrated as one of the estate's greatest achievements, it houses thousands of volumes beneath soaring ceilings. It is described as a sanctuary of intellect. Yet its scale overwhelms solitude. The room does not invite casual reading. It demands reverence. It is a place to be seen inside, not a place to disappear quietly. That logic repeats everywhere. Fireplaces dominate walls rather than anchor seating. Furniture favors symmetry over comfort. Chairs are arranged for posture, not rest. Even bedrooms feel formal, as though they expect inspection rather than sleep. The house does not respond to its occupants' emotional needs. It instructs them. European aristocratic estates mitigated this through time. Rooms accumulated memory. Corners softened. Scale was absorbed into routine. Biltmore had no such buffer. It attempted to import aristocratic scale without aristocratic duration. Grandeur arrived without emotional sediment. The house never learned its occupants. It trained them. After George Vanderbilt's death, this psychological coldness intensified. Rooms closed. Entire wings fell silent. Heating was reduced. Lights went dark. The mansion grew quieter, but not cozier. Silence multiplied distance rather than intimacy. Staff remained. Family receded. What emerged was a structure operating without an emotional center. The building did not decay physically, but it hollowed psychologically. It became a place people moved through rather than lived within. This helps explain why Biltmore's later transition to public tours felt almost seamless. The house was already theatrical. Rooms were already staged. The shift from elite guest to paying visitor did not violate its internal logic. It fulfilled it. Privacy had always been secondary. This is the darker truth of old money grandeur. Extreme wealth promises insulation from loneliness, but often produces its opposite. When scale replaces closeness, human connection becomes inefficient. Emotional warmth struggles to travel across marble floors and vaulted ceilings. Loneliness at Biltmore was not dramatic. It was ambient. It lived in echoes, in distance, in rooms too large to hold ordinary life. This kind of loneliness does not announce itself. It settles quietly, normalized by beauty and ritual. Over time, it becomes indistinguishable from privilege. The mansion trained its occupants to perform rather than belong. That lesson survived the family. Today, visitors move through Biltmore guided by signage and narration. The house remains full, yet no one resides emotionally. It hosts thousands daily and belongs to none. In this sense, Biltmore achieved permanence only by abandoning domesticity entirely. The house survived by accepting that it was never truly a home. Biltmore's failure was not financial alone. It was psychological. It demonstrates that scale cannot substitute for closeness, that beauty cannot manufacture belonging, and that grandeur without intimacy produces isolation rather than legacy. The mansion stands today immaculate, preserved, admired. But its rooms still resist habitation. They invite observation, not rest. Awe replaces comfort. Admiration replaces attachment. Loneliness remains embedded in its proportions. The Vanderbilt dream did not collapse violently. It dissipated into space, too much of it, arranged too far apart, demanding attention while denying warmth. The mansion never became a home because it was never designed to be one. It was a statement first, a shelter second, and a refuge never at all. And that is why, even now, surrounded by visitors and history, Biltmore feels curiously empty, a monument to wealth so vast it forgot how to hold a life inside it. Biltmore Estate was never only about George Vanderbilt's personal taste. It was a cultural experiment, one shared quietly by America's Gilded Age elite. The question was simple, even if the answer was not. Could American wealth create an aristocracy that felt permanent? Biltmore was built as proof that it could. Its design borrowed unapologetically from Europe. The French Renaissance style, the axial gardens, the deliberate distance between owner and public. Every stone attempted to compress centuries of inherited authority into a single architectural gesture. The mansion was meant to feel ancient the moment it was finished, as if legitimacy could be manufactured through scale alone. This was the illusion. European aristocracy was never defined by buildings in isolation. It was defined by time. Land passed down across centuries. Families absorbed wars, revolutions, and declined slowly. Estates expanded, contracted, and adapted. Power endured not because it was vast, but because it was patient. American wealth had no patience. Fortunes like the Vanderbilts arrived with unprecedented speed. Railroads, shipping, steel, and finance created dynasties in decades rather than generations. But speed has consequences. Wealth that arrives quickly has not learned how to survive stillness. It expects momentum to continue indefinitely. Biltmore froze momentum into stone. George Vanderbilt attempted to import the outward form of European aristocracy without its internal structure. He copied architecture, not obligation. He replicated scale, not continuity. The estate looked legitimate, but it was unsupported by the systems that made legitimacy durable elsewhere. European estates were not isolated monuments. They were embedded within governance, agriculture, and social hierarchy. They produced food, collected rents, exercised political influence, and anchored communities. Their houses were nodes within larger systems. Biltmore stood alone. Its surrounding land did not function as a feudal base. Its owner did not wield political authority tied to territory. The mansion was not integrated into American governance. It existed as a statement rather than an institution, and statements expire. The Gilded Age elite believed architecture could replace lineage. That stone could substitute for history. That if a house was large enough, ornate enough, and expensive enough, it would compel permanence by intimidation alone. Biltmore embodied this belief at its most extreme. But permanence cannot be rushed. European aristocratic estates evolved gradually. Rooms were repurposed. Wings were sealed. Families adapted to decline quietly. Scale flexed with fortune. There was elasticity built into the system. Biltmore had none. It arrived fully formed and demanded full strength forever. There was no smaller version of Biltmore to retreat into. No graceful contraction path. The estate existed in binary terms, dominance or compromise. Once compromise became necessary, aristocracy was already over. This exposed the fundamental difference between inherited aristocracy and inherited wealth. Aristocracy carries obligation forward. Wealth carries choice. When conditions change, aristocracy adapts inward. Wealth often withdraws or liquidates. The Vanderbilt fortune chose liquidation. As taxation increased, regulation tightened, and public sentiment shifted, Biltmore became politically and economically indefensible as a private seat of power. The American system did not protect private dynasties the way European systems had. Once the market and the state intervened, insulation vanished. Stone could not resist that pressure. The mansion became a beautiful anachronism almost immediately. It looked backward while America surged forward. The same forces that enabled its construction, industrial capitalism, innovation, disruption, undermined its claim to permanence. This is why Biltmore's transformation into a public attraction was not betrayal. It was revelation. The house had always been performative. It was built to be seen, not lived in. Opening it to the public simply completed the logic. Aristocracy in America could exist only as spectacle, never as authority. Once spectacle replaced power, the illusion dissolved cleanly. European aristocratic estates often remain private today, scaled down, quieter, still inhabited by descendants acting as stewards of inherited obligation. Biltmore required public admission within 1 generation of its creator's death. That single fact defines the difference between endurance and imitation. The house survived. The aristocracy did not. America could replicate the surface of aristocracy, architecture, ceremony, scale, but not the foundation that sustained it. Wealth without obligation, land without covenant, and power without continuity produce monuments, not dynasties. Biltmore is a monument to that failure. Preservation today often disguises this truth. The mansion feels timeless. The gardens remain controlled. The interiors glow with curated warmth. But preservation is not legitimacy. It is management. It is the afterlife of ambition, not its fulfillment. The original model failed. The new model replaced it. Biltmore now functions as a historical asset, not a ruling seat. It generates revenue, not authority. It invites visitors, not deference. No American family looks to it as a blueprint for dynastic power. It is admired, but never emulated. That is its final verdict. Aristocracy cannot be manufactured by wealth alone. It requires time, constraint, and continuity, qualities American capitalism actively resists. The Gilded Age produced wonders precisely because it ignored sustainability. Biltmore stands as the most refined of those wonders, and the clearest evidence of their limit. It is not a failure of taste. It is a failure of time. The estate attempted to leap centuries in a single generation. Architecturally, it succeeded. Culturally, it collapsed inward. The illusion of American aristocracy did not end in scandal or revolt. It ended quietly, through arithmetic, taxation, and adaptation. Once novelty faded, the absence of structural support became impossible to ignore. The house remains magnificent. The idea it represented does not. And that is why Biltmore matters. Not as proof of what American wealth achieved, but as evidence of what it could not sustain. Stone can imitate history, but it cannot replace it. When Biltmore Estate opened its doors to the public in 1930, it was presented as a gesture of generosity, a cultural offering, an invitation for Americans to experience one of the nation's great architectural achievements. In reality, it was an admission of failure. No aristocratic estate opens itself voluntarily. Privacy is not a luxury for power. It is a requirement. Once privacy is surrendered, authority has already eroded. What remained at Biltmore by 1930 was not dominance, but necessity. The decision did not arrive suddenly. It was the end point of a slow, grinding financial reality that began years earlier. By the 1920s, the economic environment that had enabled Biltmore's creation no longer existed. The progressive era had brought regulatory pressure. Income taxes had become permanent. Estate taxes increased. Public tolerance for concentrated wealth narrowed. The same system that once celebrated industrial excess now demanded accountability. Large estates were uniquely exposed to this shift. Biltmore was not simply expensive to maintain, it was structurally resistant to downsizing. Its power plant, agricultural operations, staff housing, and internal infrastructure functioned as an integrated system. Cutting costs meant degrading function. Degrading function meant exposing weakness. There was no discrete way to scale down. At the same time, income sources collapsed. Railroad dividends declined. Industrial returns softened. The Vanderbilt fortune, once assumed inexhaustible, revealed its dependence on economic conditions rather than permanence. Wealth that looks infinite during expansion reveals its limits during contraction. The 1920s masked this reality temporarily. Consumer optimism surged. Credit expanded. Appearances held. But Biltmore was bleeding quietly. Taxes rose year after year. Maintenance costs did not fall. Staffing remained essential just to keep the house operational. Then the illusion broke. The Great Depression did not destroy Biltmore directly. It clarified what had already become unsustainable. Liquidity vanished. Asset values fell. Tax obligations remained fixed. The estate's cost structure no longer matched its revenue reality. At that point, pride became negotiable. Opening the house to the public was framed as innovation. In truth, it was conversion. Biltmore ceased to function as private power and began functioning as an economic object. The estate was no longer a home, no longer even a symbol of dominance. It became a product. Tickets replaced invitations. Schedules replaced discretion. Visibility replaced control. This is the precise moment when power dissolves. Privacy had once insulated the Vanderbilt family from scrutiny. Now strangers walked through rooms designed to overwhelm peers, not tourists. The scale that once asserted dominance now invited curiosity. Curiosity invites interpretation. Interpretation strips authority. Every guided tour was a concession. The irony was profound. Biltmore had been engineered to separate its owners from the public entirely, geographically, architecturally, psychologically. Yet survival required the opposite. The walls that once protected privacy now framed spectacle. Aristocracy, when real, never requires explanation. Biltmore now required narration. Docents replaced hosts. Labels replaced lineage. Context replaced command. This shift altered the meaning of every room. The banquet hall no longer suggested authority. It suggested excess. The library no longer implied intellectual command. It became an artifact. Bedrooms became exhibits. Corridors became routes. The estate's power evaporated not through destruction, but through access. Public opening also changed the internal psychology of the house. A private residence absorbs memory. A public attraction absorbs traffic. The distinction matters. Memory deepens meaning. Traffic flattens it. Once opened, Biltmore could never close again, not without signaling defeat. The public became a revenue source, and revenue sources cannot be dismissed casually. Survival required consistency. Consistency required exposure. This is the hidden cost of adaptation. European aristocratic estates often reduced scale to preserve privacy. Wings closed. Rooms darkened. Staff reduced quietly. Biltmore could not follow that model. It had no centuries of buffer. No cultural tolerance for quiet contraction. The American model demanded visibility or liquidation. So visibility won. By 1930, the transformation was complete. The mansion that once symbolized separation from the public now depended on it. Power had inverted. The crowd sustained the house that once excluded it. This inversion carried reputational consequences. Once a space becomes public, it loses mystique. Mystery survives only behind closed doors. Open spaces invite judgment. Visitors do not submit to authority, they assess it. An assessment is unforgiving. Biltmore's size, once its greatest asset, became its most obvious vulnerability. Guests marveled, but they also questioned. Why so large? Why so costly? Why so impractical? The questions themselves signaled the collapse of reverence. Power is not questioned. Exhibits are. The opening also redefined the Vanderbilt legacy. Instead of dynastic continuity, the family became custodians of a historical object. Stewardship replaced sovereignty. Preservation replaced command. This was not shameful. It was necessary. But necessity is never powerful. The Great Depression cemented the transformation. As unemployment soared and inequality sharpened, large private estates became politically indefensible. Opening Biltmore was not just an economic decision, it was a social concession. It aligned the estate with public culture rather than elite insulation. But alignment comes at a cost. Once power justifies itself publicly, it has already surrendered its independence. The house survived, but the hierarchy inverted. The public now held interpretive authority. Meaning shifted outward. The Vanderbilt name no longer signified untouchable dominance. It became historical context. Biltmore's survival through tourism is often celebrated as success. Structurally, it is. Culturally, it marks the end of the original ambition. The house lives, but the aristocratic dream embedded within it does not. This is not about opening doors. It is about closing eras. The forced public opening reveals the final contradiction of American aristocracy. Wealth could build privacy, but it could not preserve it under pressure. When systems tightened, privacy became negotiable. Power became transactional. European aristocracy protected privacy even in decline because it was entwined with governance and tradition. American wealth had no such protection. Once economic logic intervened, exposure followed. Biltmore did not fall. It adapted. An adaptation is proof of failure at scale. The mansion remains extraordinary, but its meaning is fixed now. It is no longer an assertion. It is an artifact. The most private mansion in America became a destination not because its owners wanted to share it, but because they could no longer afford not to. Power ends not when doors are broken down, but when they must be opened. History did not attack Biltmore Estate directly. It pressed on it, year after year, until the house began to empty from the inside. The Great Depression did not arrive at Biltmore as a single shock. It arrived as tightening. Credit narrowed. Cash flow slowed. Taxes remained fixed. Maintenance costs refused to negotiate. What had once been merely unsustainable now became indefensible. By the early 1930s, the estate was already operating in survival mode. Opening the mansion to the public had stabilized revenue, but it did not restore power. Tourism covered costs. It did not revive authority. The house remained enormous, but its internal life was shrinking. The contradiction deepened. Outside the gates, unemployment soared and public resentment toward concentrated wealth hardened. Inside, Biltmore continued to require hundreds of workers just to remain functional. The optics were unavoidable. Scale that once suggested triumph now suggested imbalance. Rooms began to close. This was not ceremonial. It was practical. Heating in used wings wasted money. Staffing distant corridors made no sense. Sections of the house were sealed not for preservation, but for economy. Curtains were drawn. Lights went dark. Footsteps disappeared from spaces designed to be seen. The mansion did not decay. It hollowed. The Great Depression reframed luxury itself. Grandeur no longer inspired aspiration. It provoked discomfort. Even as visitors continued to arrive, the meaning of the house shifted. Guests no longer viewed Biltmore as a symbol of possibility. They viewed it as a remnant of a world that had overreached. That shift mattered. Power depends on admiration. Survival depends on tolerance. Biltmore transitioned from the first to the second. Then came war. World War II did not damage the estate physically, but it accelerated its internal contraction. Labor shortages intensified. Staff numbers dropped sharply as workers joined the military or moved into defense industries. The estate could not compete with wartime wages or patriotic obligation. Entire departments vanished. Housekeeping was reduced to essentials. Groundskeeping focused on preservation rather than presentation. Decorative maintenance slowed. Repairs were deferred. The house remained operational, but barely. The mansion's size now worked against it. Rooms built to host diplomats and dignitaries sat unused. Guest suites went untouched for years. Formal spaces existed only as volume, not function. The house no longer performed social authority. It performed endurance. Silence multiplied. The war also altered the psychological relationship between Americans and wealth. Sacrifice became the dominant virtue. Excess felt inappropriate. The idea of private palaces clashed with rationing, loss, and collective effort. Biltmore survived this shift only by reframing itself as history rather than hierarchy. Yet even that reframing carried cost. Empty rooms are not neutral. They absorb absence. Over time, they change how a building feels. Biltmore's interior climate shifted from grandeur to vacancy. Echo replaced conversation. Preservation replaced use. The estate became a place people passed through, not lived within. This transformation exposed a deeper truth. Biltmore had never been resilient. It had been impressive. Resilience requires flexibility. The mansion had none. It could not shrink gracefully. It could only close. European estates endured war by retreating inward, reducing footprint, consolidating life, preserving intimacy. Biltmore had no core small enough to retreat into. When pressure mounted, it did not compress. It emptied. By the end of the war, the estate was intact but fundamentally altered. Its social role had vanished. Its private life had ended. What remained was a preserved shell sustained by management rather than meaning. The Vanderbilt presence continued, but it was managerial, not aristocratic. Decisions were logistical. Budgets replaced vision. The house no longer projected the future. It curated the past. This is the quiet devastation of historical pressure. No scandal, no fire, no abandonment, just rooms that stopped being necessary. The house learned how to survive by becoming less alive. Visitors today often remark on how pristine Biltmore feels. What they rarely notice is how much of it is unused. The scale remains visible, but the life that once justified it does not. The building stands whole while its original purpose exists only in interpretation. That is the legacy of depression and war. They did not destroy Biltmore. They clarified it. They stripped away illusion and left function exposed. The mansion survived because it surrendered its original claim to power. It accepted preservation over dominance, access over privacy, and history over ambition. The rooms that remain closed are the truest record of this. They are not damaged. They are unnecessary. An unnecessary space is the final verdict on excess. This is where the signature line belongs. Biltmore survived history, but it did not escape it. History reduced the house without breaking it. It forced adaptation without collapse. It transformed authority into artifact and ambition into lesson. By the mid-20th century, Biltmore was no longer a challenge to the American system. It was proof of it. Proof that even the largest private mansion in the nation could not stand unchanged against economic contraction, social realignment, and global conflict. The estate endured. The dream did not. What remained was space, beautiful, controlled, and increasingly empty. And emptiness, when preserved long enough, becomes meaning. Biltmore's empty rooms are not failures of maintenance. They are evidence. Evidence that scale without sustainability always pays its price. Not all at once, but steadily, until silence fills what grandeur once claimed. The house stands today because it learned how to endure pressure. But it stands changed. And change, at this scale, is history leaving its mark. By the late 20th century, Biltmore Estate had solved a problem that had haunted it since its creation. The mansion was finally profitable. This fact is often presented as triumph. It is not. It is evidence of surrender. Biltmore's modern success did not arrive through preservation of George Vanderbilt's original vision. It arrived through its abandonment. Every profitable component of the estate today, wine production, hospitality, events, retail, and mass tourism, exists because the mansion ceased to function as what it was meant to be, a private aristocratic seat. The shift was gradual, pragmatic, and irreversible. By the mid-20th century, it was clear that tourism alone could not fully absorb the estate's costs. Public access stabilized finances, but it did not generate surplus. Maintenance remained relentless. Restoration costs increased as the building aged. Climate control, conservation, staffing, and infrastructure demanded continuous investment. Survival required expansion, but not the kind George Vanderbilt had imagined. The solution was diversification. The winery marked the first decisive break from the original dream. Wine production introduced a renewable revenue stream tied to land use rather than architecture. It transformed portions of the estate from symbolic landscape into productive asset. Rows of vines replaced idle acreage. Agricultural nostalgia became agricultural commerce. This was not aristocracy. It was enterprise. The winery succeeded precisely because it rejected exclusivity. Wine is meant to circulate. It is branded, marketed, shipped, and sold. Its value increases with distribution, not privacy. The estate embraced this logic fully, creating tasting rooms, retail operations, and national distribution channels. The house no longer stood apart from the market. It entered it. Hotels followed. Hospitality expanded beyond the mansion itself into carefully designed accommodations that absorbed visitor demand without compromising preservation standards. Guests no longer simply toured Biltmore. They stayed. They booked experiences. They consumed packages. The estate became a destination economy rather than a cultural monument alone. This altered the relationship between visitor and space. Guests were no longer observers of wealth. They were customers. Their presence was transactional, not deferential. The estate adjusted accordingly. Comfort replaced reverence. Accessibility replaced intimidation. Experience replaced authority. Events completed the transformation. Weddings, corporate retreats, seasonal festivals, and curated exhibitions turned the estate into a flexible venue. Space that once symbolized separation now facilitated congregation. Rooms designed to assert hierarchy hosted celebrations. The mansion adapted not by defending its past, but by monetizing its scale. This is the uncomfortable truth. Biltmore survived by becoming ordinary in function, even as it remained extraordinary in form. The original Vanderbilt dream required insulation from the public. Modern success depends on constant engagement with it. Every profitable arm of the estate contradicts the logic of aristocracy. Aristocratic power avoids visibility. Commercial success requires it. This inversion is total. Where George Vanderbilt sought permanence through withdrawal, the modern estate sustains itself through exposure. Where the original vision depended on inherited wealth, the current model depends on earned revenue. Where privacy once defined status, accessibility now defines survival. The mansion did not evolve. It was repurposed. This repurposing is often framed as stewardship, and in practical terms, it is. The estate is beautifully maintained. Restoration standards are high. Historical interpretation is careful. None of this is false. But stewardship is not success on original terms. The Vanderbilt ambition was not to create a profitable attraction. It was to establish an enduring private domain modeled on European aristocracy. By that measure, Biltmore failed completely. Within a generation, privacy was lost. Within 2 generations, authority dissolved. Within 3, the house functioned as a business. Modern profitability is real. Original legitimacy is not. This distinction matters because it reframes how Biltmore should be understood. It is not a story of delayed success. It is a story of necessary reinvention. The mansion did not achieve its purpose later. It abandoned it. The American system demanded this outcome. There was no path for Biltmore to remain both private and solvent. Taxes, labor costs, social norms, and economic volatility made aristocratic insulation impossible. The only viable alternative was commodification, and commodification worked. The estate today operates as a sophisticated tourism enterprise. Revenue streams are diversified. Risk is managed. Branding is consistent. The business model is resilient. In purely operational terms, Biltmore is a success. But success defined by adaptation is different from success defined by intent. The original dream assumed that scale would create permanence. The modern model proves the opposite. Scale created vulnerability. Flexibility created survival. The mansion lived because it learned to stop insisting on what it was meant to be. This is the final lesson of old American wealth. Unlike European aristocracy, which endured by constraining itself, American excess endured only by reinventing itself. Those estates that refused disappeared. Those that adapted survived, but only by becoming something else entirely. Biltmore chose survival. That choice preserved the building and erased the dream. Today, visitors encounter curated grandeur rather than lived authority. The estate feels vibrant because it is busy. Restaurants are full. Hotels operate year-round. Events fill the calendar. The mansion hums with activity. But activity is not power. Power commands without asking. Commerce persuades continuously. Biltmore now persuades. Its success depends on appeal, not dominance. On experience, not exclusion. On relevance, not reverence. The house stands not because it rules, but because it sells. This is not a criticism. It is a diagnosis. The Vanderbilt experiment tested whether American wealth could leap directly into aristocracy through architecture alone. The answer was no. But the experiment also demonstrated something else. That reinvention, not inheritance, defines American endurance. The mansion's continued existence proves adaptation works. Its transformed function proves the original vision did not. That is the paradox at the heart of modern Biltmore. It thrives because it stopped trying to be what it was built to be. The house that once rejected the public now relies on it. The estate that symbolized withdrawal now depends on participation. The dream of insulated permanence dissolved into a model of managed exposure. The stone remains. The meaning changed. This chapter closes the argument clearly. Biltmore's modern success is undeniable. Its original ambition failed absolutely. Both truths coexist. And understanding that coexistence is the only honest way to read the estate today. Not as a triumph of old money, but as a case study in how American excess survives only by surrendering its claims to permanence. The mansion stands because it learned to let go. And in that letting go, it tells the clearest story of all. When visitors walk through Biltmore Estate today, they are often struck by a contradiction they cannot immediately name. The rooms are immaculate. The furniture is preserved. The ceilings soar. The fireplaces stand ready. Everything appears intact, yet nothing feels inhabited. That absence is the point. Biltmore survives not as a home, not as a dynasty, and not as an expression of living power, but as a preserved argument about American wealth. It represents what happens when money arrives faster than meaning, when scale is mistaken for endurance, and when ambition builds monuments without building a future capable of sustaining them. At its core, Biltmore is not a success story. It is a case study. The Vanderbilt fortune that made Biltmore possible was unprecedented in speed and size. Railroad monopolies generated wealth on a scale no American family had previously controlled. But that wealth did not emerge from centuries of land ownership, political integration, or cultural obligation. It emerged from industrial acceleration, fast, concentrated, and detached from long-term stewardship. George Vanderbilt attempted to convert that velocity into permanence through architecture. He believed that stone could do what institutions and tradition had not yet done in America: stabilize power across generations. Biltmore was designed to freeze a moment of excess into something timeless. It failed. The mansion was completed just as the Vanderbilt empire began to fracture. Not collapse immediately, but weaken structurally. The forces that created the fortune were already losing coherence. Regulation increased. Competition expanded. Family control diluted. The wealth that built Biltmore no longer behaved the way it had when the idea was conceived. This is the first lesson Biltmore represents. Wealth without purpose does not endure. The fortune that funded the estate had no guiding mission beyond accumulation. Railroads were not treated as civic infrastructure or national responsibility, but as instruments of control and profit. Once that control weakened, there was no deeper purpose to stabilize the system. No unifying vision remained that could justify the scale Biltmore demanded. European aristocracies survived not because they were richer, but because their wealth was embedded in obligation, land stewardship, political continuity, and social responsibility that extended beyond individual lifetimes. American industrial wealth lacked that anchoring. It produced monuments instead. Biltmore is the largest of those monuments. The second lesson is harsher. Scale without sustainability becomes burden, not power. Biltmore was never designed to operate within limits. Every system, staffing, heating, maintenance, restoration, assumed uninterrupted wealth. The house did not scale down gracefully. It demanded full commitment or collapse. There was no middle state where it could exist comfortably with reduced resources. This made it fragile from the beginning. The estate required hundreds of employees, a private power plant, constant repairs, and perpetual investment. These demands did not diminish with time, they intensified. As wealth contracted, the house did not adapt. It resisted, and resistance accelerated decline. When George Vanderbilt died in 1914, the vision died with him. The mansion outlived its creator, but lost its reason. His heirs did not inherit a flexible asset. They inherited an obligation that consumed capital faster than it generated meaning. What followed, land sales, public opening, commercialization, were not betrayals of the original vision. They were admissions that the vision was unsustainable. Which leads to the third lesson. Ambition without a future rewrites itself or disappears. Biltmore did not disappear because it was too large to erase easily. Instead, it rewrote itself. It shifted from private domain to public attraction, from aristocratic seat to managed experience. This adaptation preserved the structure, but erased its original intent. Today, the estate is successful precisely because it no longer claims to be what it once was. It does not assert dominance. It invites participation. It does not project authority. It offers access. The rooms are preserved, but the family is absent. This absence is not accidental. It is structural. No Vanderbilt lineage resides at Biltmore as a seat of power. No decisions shaping national life are made within its walls. No authority emanates from its towers. What remains is architecture without agency. That is why the mansion feels both alive and hollow at the same time. Visitors move through dining rooms where no family dines. They stand in bedrooms that are never slept in. They admire libraries whose books are curated, not used. The spaces function as representations, not environments. They are complete and inert. Biltmore represents the moment American wealth learned that it could not simply imitate European aristocracy and expect the same outcome. It could copy the form, stone, scale, ornament, but not the foundation. Without centuries of embedded obligation and continuity, the form collapsed inward. This is not a moral judgment. It is an economic and cultural reality. American capitalism excels at creation, expansion, and reinvention. It struggles with permanence. Biltmore exposes that tension more clearly than almost any structure in the country. It stands as proof that excess can be built quickly, but must be managed endlessly, or else surrendered. The rewritten legacy of Biltmore is therefore honest in its own way. The estate today does not pretend to be a ruling house. It acknowledges itself as a preserved artifact supported by commerce. It survives through tickets, events, wine sales, and hospitality. Its authority has been replaced by relevance, its privacy by accessibility. In this sense, Biltmore represents the American solution to excess. When permanence fails, pivot. That pivot saved the building. It did not save the dream. And that distinction matters. Because the dream Biltmore embodied, the idea that wealth alone could manufacture legitimacy and endurance, failed completely. The house survived only after renouncing that belief. What remains is a preserved contradiction. A mansion built to exclude now depends on crowds. A private refuge now operates as a public enterprise. A symbol of insulation now thrives on exposure. This is the final image Biltmore leaves behind. Preserved rooms. Absent family. Rewritten legacy. The furniture remains exactly where it was placed. The portraits hang without descendants beneath them. The scale still overwhelms. But the power that once animated the space is gone, replaced by interpretation and foot traffic. Biltmore does not represent triumph. It represents adaptation after failure. It teaches that American wealth, when divorced from purpose and continuity, cannot anchor itself through architecture alone. It must either transform or vanish. Biltmore chose transformation. The house stands today not as proof that excess endures, but as proof that it must change to survive. And in that survival, the mansion tells the truth its builders never intended to admit. Stone can preserve memory, that IT cannot preserve authority.